Almost forgot to record. Okay. We are going to read this week the final acts of the challenge to Paro to let Israel go free. We have the eighth plague, which is introduced, the locust. Then the ninth plague is darkness. It's understood to be a darkness that you could feel. It was so heavy that people couldn't even move around, is the way it's explained by the rabbis. And then the last one, of course, is the slaying of the firstborn, which has its problems. And because it's deemed that everyone in Egypt, from the lowest to the highest, was going to suffer from this plague. Especially in the ancient world, how much responsibility do other members of the society have for what the rulership does? It's a good question, and one worth debating and thinking about. But at least the rabbinic tradition understands them to have been mistreating the Jewish people as well. But prior to the last plague, we have the mitzvah of the taking a kid, a goat. Well, first of all, in chapter 12, it says this begins the new moon. This is the first of the months of the year. We may look at that a little bit later. And they're told that they're supposed to gather together for the 14th of the month and to sacrifice, take a lamb, put its blood on the doorposts of the house, and to eat that animal completely roasted over fire, and nothing is to be left over till the morning. It's interesting. Most people, when they hear the story about, I don't think we talked about this, putting the blood on the doorposts of the house, most people assume they're talking about the outside of the doors, facing the street. One of the classic commentaries, the Ibn Ezra, says no, the blood was put inside. The sign, because what is the purpose of the sign? If God can tell who's a firstborn, who's not a firstborn, and kills only the firstborn in the family, but not the others, couldn't he tell if that's a Jewish house or not? I mean, interesting question. What does he need that for? So everybody agrees that the sign was really more for the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, to acknowledge that they are accepting these responsibilities of living according to the Torah that they were given. And that's why, according to Ibn Ezra, it was on the inside. He suggested that on the outside, it might have endangered them from the Egyptians. I don't know how many of you have seen the famous Cecil B. DeMille 10 Commandments movie, which plays every year around Easter time. You will see that Joshua I think it's Joshua, who's in love with this other girl and is married to the bad Jewish guy, putting blood on the outside of the house to protect it. But when we come to the Passover Seder, one of the most important or famous passages in the Seder talks about the 4 different kinds of children. The wise son or child, the wicked, the one who doesn't know the simple one, and one does not know how to ask. And one of the explanations about the wicked son is they say that had he been there, he would not have been redeemed. Why? Because he would not have put the blood on the doorposts. He wouldn't have followed the mitzvah. And since he wouldn't follow the mitzvah, he would not have been worthy of being freed from the Egyptian bondage. In any case, the final stage comes. Israel is freed. We're told about the matzah, that they are told actually twice about matzah. When they first learn about the celebration of the holiday, the punishment, it says, "This is how you shall eat it, your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to the Lord." This day shall be to you one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord through the ages. You celebrate it as an institution for all time. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the very first day, you shall move leaven from your house. Whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, the person will be cut off from Israel, and to celebrate the sacred occasion, etc. So we're told about the mitzvah of leavened bread originally with the story of Passover. But a little bit later, we're told that when they left Egypt, they didn't have time to let the bread rise. And therefore, that's why they ate unleavened bread. So we have both of those. And again, when we come to Passover, I'll talk in some detail about how the same thing becomes an emblem both of servitude, of bondage, and of freedom. So we are told about their going out of Egypt. They make their way out. The Egyptians even push them out. They don't want them around anymore. Pharaoh says, "Go, get out of here," and etc. Okay. We're also told about the idea that the firstborn sons have a special role, special sanction, and therefore they have to be redeemed. And we'll talk about that in life cycle things later on in the course of the year. Okay. We will move on now to our Hebrew. So we go to share the screen. All righty. And once again, I'll ask everybody to unmute themselves. Let me point out that we're now talking about a special case. Normally, a consonant sound precedes the vowel sound. Under normal circumstances, under normal circumstances, by this, we would pronounce it as cha. We've learned the letter chet. But there's a special change that happens at the end of a word. At the end of the word, if it appears this way, the chet with the patach underneath it, the vowel sound is first. It's not cha, but ah. It says ach, not cha. So reach, luach, all these words down here, because it's very difficult to pronounce the het at the end of a word after another vowel by setup, right? Reach, luach are much more difficult to pronounce. And so in order to enable people to sound the het sound at the end of a word, the tradition was that under certain circumstances, you'd have it with the het, with the patach under it. And so it would be pronounced as an ah and not a ha. So the first word here is, let's read it all together, is reach. Everybody? Reach. And the second one is reach.
Reach.
Luach.
Luach.
And by the way, the word luach means a board, but also it can mean a calendar. The luach, the calendar. Yareach. Yareach. Poteach.
Poteach.
Ruach.
Ruach.
Okay. Line number 2. Rotzeach.
Rotzeach.
Tirtzach. Tirtzach.
What was that word again?
Tirtzach.
Tirtzach. Okay, thank you.
Right, because you see the vowels is under the tzadi anyway. Right, and what we have here is resuach. Betoch. Lachatz. Okay, we'll go down to line 3. Menoach.
Noach.
That was a little, let's try it again. It kind of petered out there. Menoach.
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 Okay, so that just says the long version of the vowels there. Menucha.
Menucha.
Menucha. See now, if you're listening to it, if you don't make any distinction, which most of us don't, you won't know the difference between menucha and menucha. This is actually menucha, cha, and this is menucha. Most of us can't make the difference in the sound because we're not used to that guttural sounding, but that's one of the reasons that there are different pronunciations. I don't remember what menucha means. The first one, menucha, is rest. Shabbat menucha, restful Shabbos. Or Shabbos rest. The last one is tzenuach.
Tzenuach.
Tapuach.
Tapuach.
Poteach.
Poteach.
Meniach.
Meniach.
Meniach. Someach.
Someach.
Lehochiach.
Lehochiach.
Line number 5. Moach.
Moach.
Lehit.
Lehit.
Pateach.
Teach.
Lehit pateach. Yeah, it's a long word there. We're getting pateach is opening, right? And lehit pateach is get it open. Petucha.
Petucha.
Okay, so we now have all the letters and sounds that we need in order to say the bracha for eating bread. So let's read that together. We say Baruch.
Baruch.
Atah.
Atah. Adonai.
Eloheinu.
Eloheinu.
Melech.
Melech.
Haolam.
Haolam.
Hamotzi.
Hamotzi.
Lechem.
Lechem.
Min. Haaretz. Right. Bless you, Adonai God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Okay. So we have here a nice review page. Okay, so we have on line number 1. Etzba.
Etzba.
Rachetz.
Rachetz.
Tarutz.
Tarutz.
Poretz.
Poretz.
Leaf rots.
Leaf rots.
Noach. Noah.
Listen, I would talk. Oh.
I'm sorry? It's
No, I was saying, oh, are we talking about Noah?
Yeah, why not? That's why in English it's spelled with an H, because English doesn't have a het sound. How do you, sometimes they'll write it Noah, Noah in English, or sometimes you might see it Noach, Noach. But now you know that's not Noach, it'd have to be Noach. Okay. Heniach,
Heniach.
Mincha,
Mincha.
Chatzitz,
Tzatzit.
Ruach,
Ruach.
Rucha.
Ruha.
Line 3. Lech,
Lech.
Lecha,
Leha.
Zon,
Son.
Zon,
Son.
Zon. That's what they did here. Som
Som.
and Sameh.
Sameh.
And number 4. Yafeh is the Hebrew word for Shana. Yafeh, pretty, nice. Yefet,
Yefet.
the accent shifts. Remember the 2 segals, so it's Yefet, not Yefet. Yefet, Yaft, Yaft, Ya'eh, Ya'eh, Yagia, Gamarti.
Gamarti.
Let me tell you a little secret, not a secret. Languages change. Words have different sense of meaning. Gamarti means I finished. It's a nice biblical word, but you don't use it today too much to say you finished a meal, because it has a lewd connotation. You say siamti today instead of gamarti. I don't know. I'm not an Israeli speaker, so I can't tell you, but that's the reality. Okay, so gamarti, I finished. Gamarta, gamarta,
Gamarta.
you finished, male. Gamart,
Gamar.
you feminine, finished. Gamarten,
Gamarten.
you female, all right, female plural. Gamru,
Gamru.
Gamru, male, they finished. Okay. Line 6. Mif'al, Hif'il,
Lifil.
Hit'a'el, Al,
Pal.
and Huf'al. These are actually all names of conjugations in Hebrew, not congregations, conjugations. Okay, line number 7. Hi,
Hi.
Ayim,
Hayim.
Bayit,
Bait.
Beit,
Bait.
Ayil.
Ayim.
All right, Beit is house, and Beit means house of. Beit is a house by itself. So Beth Avram, Beis Yisrael. I'm trying to remember what's Beis Yisrael is another city. Beth Emeth. Beth Emeth is really in Hebrew would be Beit Emet or Beis Emes. Right? And so they spelled it one way. Beth Emes, what's the whole name? Beth Emes. What's the Emes? Oh, they just switched the Beis Yehuda. Beth Emes, Beis Yehuda. Beth and Beis are the same word. but because there were two synagogues that came together, one was Beth Emet, and the other was Beis Emes. So they didn't change the names, but they contradict each other in the spellings.
So, Rabbi, Beit Din means house of Beit Din, which is the major
Court.
three rabbis court.
Yeah, a Beit Din is a court.
Okay.
The house of
So it's
judges.
not house of judges. Got it.
Right? But in that case, it means a group of judges.
Got it.
Like Ben in Hebrew, we talk about a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, and people say it means son of the commandment, daughter of the commandment. No, it doesn't. Yeah, you can. That's too literal of a translation. In those cases, it means someone who is subject to the commandments. All right, and Beit Din means a place where really it means a place where judgment takes place, but then becomes transferred to the name of the court that's meeting there.
Rabbi, question for you too. I'm kind
Yes.
of curious. So for the synagogue, Bet Tikva, what does the word Tikva mean? Does it
Hope.
mean anything? Tikva?
Hope. House of Hope.
Yes. Okay, beautiful. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Yes.
The national anthem of Israel is Hatikva, the hope.
Mhm.
Okay. So line 8, we have Bocher,
Bocher,
Okay.
Bocher,
Bocher,
Ba'a,
Ba'ah,
Bayalim,
Bayalim,
Melech,
Melech,
Surcha,
Surcha,
Rotseach,
Rotseach,
Rachamim,
Rachamim,
and Yinachem.
Yenachem,
Okay.
And line 10, Amart,
Amat,
Pilpel,
Pilpel,
Milachim,
Melachim,
and Lechem.
Lechem.
Okay, we'll do one last letter. The letter Shin. Notice it's got 3 lines. Okay, and when the vowels are there, it will always have a dot on the right hand side. So when it's on the right hand side of this letter, under normal circumstances, it means it's pronounced SH, Shin, as in Shabbat. We'll see there's when the dot is on the other side, we'll see its difference with it. Okay. So line number 1, we have sh, she,
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 shay,
She,
shay,
She,
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 shu.
Shoe,
They forgot the dot here, but it's show.
Show,
Okay. Line number 2. Shar,
Shar,
shame,
Shame,
shin,
Shin,
shum.
Shum,
Yeah, get that out correct because you want your garlic, your shum. Shots,
Shots,
shelcha,
Shelcha,
and shuf.
Shuf,
Okay, line 3. Shir,
Shir,
Sharim,
Sharim,
Shalem,
Shalem.
Shalem,
Shalem.
Lashon,
Lashon,
Shana,
Shana,
Shoresh.
Shoresh.
Line 4. This is a word everybody should know.
Shalom.
Shalom,
Shalom. Very good.
Yeah.
Shalom. Shalemim.
Shalem.
Shalom,
Shechem.
Shechem,
Shibor.
Shibor,
Busha.
Usha.
Usha.
Don't be embarrassed to say it.
Usha.
Embarrass.
True.
Right?
That means embarrassed.
Meet Bayesh. Careful not to Bayesh somebody. Be careful not to embarrass someone. Meet Rachetz.
Meet, Rachet,
Meet Bayeshet.
Meet,
Meet.
Yeshet,
Rasha,
Rasha,
which means evil, wicked. Don't be a Rasha or a Russia, they say in the Yiddish inflection. And the last one is, yes,
Moshe.
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 or like Moses, Moshe.
Now, in older books, and unfortunately they decided to do it this way here in this book, when you, in order to save space and ink, if you have the O vowel, which is here, right? That indicates the O sound. And after that's followed by a shin, they let it serve both purposes. So you got to figure out that the letter mem has to have a vowel associated with it. So the only possible thing could be that dot on top of the shin. In the Koren Sidur that we have,
line 3?
well, I'm sorry,
Line 3, the last word has both.
Shoresh. Did I skip that line?
No, you didn't, but it's got both the
Okay,
dot on the
so,
left.
okay, when you have,
Sure.
in this case,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I should clarify it for you. All right. The first dot can't be an O because there's nothing in front of it.
Hmm.
You
Okay.
only have that short that vowel like that when it's preceded by a consonant. So that's got to be a shin, and then that's got to be an O afterwards.
Okay.
I went, you know,
Yeah.
I didn't even see it myself, to be honest with you. So used to it. But I was going to say, in the Koren Sidur and the Art Scroll Sidur now, a lot of books that are being published today, they put 2 dots here. All right, they would be very careful not to let 1 dot serve both purposes. And the last thing they want us to understand here is that when you have this vowel, it's a patach with the 2 dots with a shva with it, called a chatav patach. You don't need to remember the name, but it sounds just like the patach. This is going to be a, just like this is a. There's grammatical rules for why that's there. We're not going to worry about it. So that this word here is asher. Asher. Grammatically, it should be a shva, but you can't have an aleph pronounced with a shva. That's impossible. Okay, so therefore, that vowel comes into being. All right.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
At what point did we start adding the vowels into the Hebrew? Because I was looking at different writings and I was kind of practicing reading, and there's some scriptures that don't have the vowels, which makes it super hard a guess what it says.
Okay, the vowel system that we use today was invented or created around the 9th century, 8th or 9th century. I don't remember exact dating on it, the Masoretes. Whereas actually the truth of the matter is there were a couple different versions. And I have one book that was written using a slightly different version of the vowel system that we have. All right? But it was added around that. However, already at a certain stage of history, let me just get this phone out of the way here. Yeah, I know. I've got the class on now. My calendar is telling me we have a class right now. I forgot to turn it off before. Okay. No, there's a video of my grandson. I'll look at that later. Already in the biblical period, it's clear that they were having issues with pronunciation of some things. And so some letters were used as a vowel indicator. For example, in the book of Samuel and the book of Kings, Shmuel and Malachim, King David is spelled Daled Vav Daled, DVD. Right? In English lettering, DVD.
No, wait.
Now, it would be, if you don't
It's
know,
Ralph.
that's David.
Yeah, how did you figure that out?
You could make the mistake of thinking it's Dode, which means uncle.
E, because it's yod.
So
Doesn't
in
have any
some of the
code.
later
Those-
writings, they started to add the letter Yud
Because the
after
aleph
vav.
tells me that the rage is turned
That
to
would
an
tell
E.
you that that's an
Lamed
E
is
sound.
Ralph.
Dalet,
So
Vav,
it should have nikuds underneath, but it
which have
doesn't.
Nikud underneath. I'm sorry, somebody's talking. I don't know what they're asking about.
Sorry, we weren't muted. We're just figuring this problem out with the nikuds.
Nikud. Okay, so the Nikud. Now, if you know grammar, you often, if you're, you got enough background, you know Hebrew well enough, biblical Hebrew and things like that, you generally can figure out what a word's supposed to be. And the grammar of it when dots are added and not added. But in modern Israel, in Israeli Hebrew, they don't use the dots and dashes, the nikud. And so they spell a lot of words with extra letters to make it easier to pronounce. Now, again, one example we know of is the ah at the end of a word, apparently, which is a difference between male and female. Melech is king, Malka is queen. But in Old Hebrew, you might have written it, both of them would be MLK. You would know it's Melech or Malka. When they started making final letters, then it helped, but that was no difference originally perhaps for the Melech and Malka either. So what they did was they put the letter Hey at the end of the word. It's not a root letter of the word, it's added to indicate the ah sound at the end. So it develops over the course of time. It's pretty much finished by the 8th, 9th centuries of the Common Era by the Masoretes in Tiberias. And that's the system that we use till today. Okay. I know I sent out to you last night some sources that we're going to look at it maybe tonight. And I don't know if I sent you, I think I sent you this sheet out as well.
Yeah, we got this one.
Yeah, okay. Because now we're going to talk about rabbinic literature. And by rabbinic literature, what we really mean is what the rabbis call the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah. So according to Jewish tradition, there are essentially really two Torahs, as it were. One is the written Torah, in Hebrew, Torah Shebichtav. I didn't put in the vowels on this chart. Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah. And simultaneously with that, we had the oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh. And that's how the rabbis understood it. What does that mean? That all kinds of interpretations, elucidations that were necessary were given to Moses at Sinai. And anything that any student of Torah is even going to come up with, an understanding in the future, according to one midrash, was already revealed to Moses at Sinai. We read in Kohelet last week, Ecclesiastes, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh, nothing new under the sun. That's how the rabbis understood it. However, I think I told you this, I'm pretty sure I told you this story. There's another midrash. It says that as it were, Moses, before God gave him the whole Torah, saw God writing out the Torah and putting little lines on top of some of the letters, tagin, crowns. And Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, said to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to God, what's that for? He says, well, there's going to be a great rabbi who's going to explain all kinds of things based upon that. He says, so show me. So God says to him, turn around. Moses turns around and finds himself in the last row of the schoolhouse of Rabbi Akiva. The smarter you were, the more learned, the closer to the front of the room you were. So Moses sits down and he hears Rabbi Akiva giving a sermon or a lesson, and he doesn't understand anything's going on. Goes back to God. I thought you were going to show me what happens in my Torah. This rabbi who's going to explain things. And he says, patience, Moses, go back. So Moses turns around, sits down, and finally one of the students says, but Rabbi Akiva, how do you know this? And he says, it's a law from Moses at Sinai. It's been passed down to us from Moses. Now, what does that mean? It means that they understood that literally not every word of what they call the oral Torah was indeed given to Moses. Moses couldn't understand what Rabbi Akiva was talking about. The minimum understanding, I think, of what the oral Torah, the oral law is, the necessary background to understand the written text. Again, it's an example I use all of the time. I think most of you probably have a driver's license. You know what a driver's license is. 200 years ago, would they know what a driver's license was? And who knows, another 200 years with self-driving cars and everything, they may not know what a driver's license is. So if you're writing a book about the 21st century and you talk about somebody showing a police officer his or her driver's license, somebody might not know what you're talking about. We would, because we understand the background. Similarly, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says that when a man finds some ervat davar, some unseemly thing about his wife, and he writes her sefer kritut, a bill of divorce, and he gives it to her and sends her away, that's a divorce. What's a sefer kritut? What does it consist of? So minimally, you have to have some background to understand the written law. So the most traditional vision is it's all starts with Moses, gets handed down. It gets corrupted a little bit because not all the students are as good as students as they should be. That's why we have disagreements. But it all goes back to God, delivered to Moses at Sinai. A more critical version of it would be to say, yes, there was an original background understanding of Torah. And as time went by, the rabbis, the various teachers of each generation interpreted, understood what it meant, tried to explain it the best they could. And that now becomes the collection of the oral Torah, the oral law. Okay. Now, the written Torah is what we have in the Tanakh, right? The Bible, the 24 books of the Bible. The oral Torah is collected in two different ways. One way is Midrash, and the other way is Mishnah. Midrash was explaining what's in the Torah. It was anchored to the text of the Torah. Some of it, and we'll see in a minute, there are two different kinds, but normally if you pick up a book that's a Midrashic book, most of them are ordered following the Torah portions. If you open the first page of the first volume of that Midrashic collection, it will begin with the first words of the book that it's commenting on. For example, Genesis Rabbah, Breshit Rabbah, starts at the beginning of Breshit. On the other hand, there were some collections much later on that are topical, but most part it followed the text of the Torah and it commented as it were explaining it. So that, let's see. Here's an example of Breshit Rabbah at the very beginning of Breshit Rabbah. It opens up like this. The great Rabbi Hoshaya opened. This is a form, Matt, that seems to have been like sermons originally. So he opened his sermon with using this verse from the book of Proverbs, Mishlei. I, meaning the Torah, was an Ammon to him, and I was a plaything to him every day. So he uses the word Ammon. And now, what is Ammon? Ammon means pedagogue. Interestingly enough, they're translating it from a Hebrew word to a word that comes from Greek. Nanny, pedagogue. Another interpretation, Ammon means covered. Another interpretation, Ammon means hidden. And there's one who says Ammon means great. Ammon means nanny. How do I know it means nanny? Now it quotes a passage in Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers. As a nanny, Omain carries the suckling child. Ammon means covered, as in the book of Lamentations, Eicha. Those who were covered, emunim in scarlet, have embraced refuge heaps. Ammon means hidden, as in the book of Esther. He hid away Omain Hadassah. Ammon means great, as in the prophet Nahum. Are you better than no Ammon, which dwells in the rivers, which the Targum, the Aramaic translations, renders as, are you better than Alexandria the Great, Ammon, which dwells between the rivers? You know, we haven't gotten to Breshit yet. Hold on. So alternatively, Ammon means artisan, which is indeed one of the words for an artisan. The Torah is saying, I was the artisan tool of Hashem. In the way of the world, a king of flesh and blood who builds a castle does not do so from his own knowledge, but rather from the knowledge of an architect. And the architect does not build it from his own knowledge, but rather he has scrolls and books in order to know how to make rooms and doorways. So too Hashem, God, gazed into the Torah and created the world. Similarly, the Torah says, through the Reshis Hashem, or the Reshit Hashem, through the Reshit, Hashem created heavens and earth, or through Reshit, God created the heavens and earth. And Reshit means Torah, as in the text, God made me, the Torah, in the beginning, Reshit, of his ways. And this is a very long-winded, because this is a very formal kind of midrash. But what is the purpose of it? The purpose of it is to explain the word Bereshit, the very first word of the Torah. What does Bereshit mean? So the rabbis are homiletically understanding it to mean that God created the world by using the Torah as his guidebook. And so Bereshit means not in the beginning or when God began creating, but it means through or with the Torah, God created heaven and earth. Now, it's a very deep thought that the rabbis have here, but the point I wanted to make is not that you necessarily understand all of this, although it is fascinating, but this is the very first paragraph in the book called Breshit Rabbah, or Genesis Rabbah, Great Genesis, a collection of midrashim on the book of Genesis. In the number 2 that would follow, it would keep going. along that, talking about that first verse, perhaps in this convoluted way. Now, in the Midrashim were collected and put in different books over the course of time, over the course of centuries. Most of it dates back to the rabbinic era, but some is later. And some of it we'll find being used in the Talmud. But it's not always so easy to follow, right, as we're talking about here. So a scholar by the name of Louis Ginsburg, who was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where I studied. This was back in the early days of the seminary. So we're talking about the early 1900s. Took a kind of a review of all of the Midrashic collections that he could find and put them together, just the story aspect of it, or without the all of the details that we found in that first version. So this is from the opening of Louis Ginsburg's book. You can find it there's a 1-volume version of it, Legends of the Jews, and then there's a 6-volume version of it, which has got all the footnotes and telling you where everything comes from. So here's how he summarized a number of the Midrashim, and it relates now back to what we just read. In the beginning, 2,000 years before the heaven and the earth, 7 things were created. The Torah written with black fire and white fire and lying in the lap of God. The divine throne erected in the heaven, which was later over the heads of the Chayot. These are kind of angelic beings. Paradise, heaven, on the right side of God. Hell, or Gehinnom was probably the Hebrew, on the left side. The celestial sanctuary, the temple above, directly in front of God, having a jewel on its altar graven with the name of the Messiah, and a voice that cries aloud, "Return, ye children of men." This really combines together a lot of different midrashim that talk about things that preceded the creation of the world, according to the rabbis. When God resolved upon the creation of the world, took counsel with the Torah. Now we're anthropomorphizing. Her advice was this: "O Lord, a king without an army and without courtiers and attendants hardly deserves the name of king, for none is nigh to express the homage due to him." Right? How can you be a king without people around saluting you? The answer pleased God exceedingly. Thus did he teach all earthly kings by his divine example to undertake naught without first consulting advisors. So you want to be a good king? Check with your advisors before you do anything. The advice of the Torah was given with some reservation. She was skeptical about the value of an earthly world on account of the sinfulness of men who would be sure to disregard her precepts. But God dispelled her doubts. He told her that repentance had been created long before, and sinners would have the opportunity of mending their ways. Besides, the temple service we invested with atoning power, and paradise and hell were intended to do duty as reward and punishment. Finally, the Messiah was appointed to bring salvation, which would put an end to all sinfulness. So Louis Ginsburg pulls together a lot of different midrashim into this. These homiletic midrash, or midrash agadah. And often this kind of midrash is meant to elucidate on the passages, to teach us lessons, to fill in gaps that aren't spelled out. Elsewhere we have talks about who did Cain marry? Why did Cain and Abel have a fight? None of that is spelled out in the Torah. And often the midrash comes into being because there's a problem. And I like to use the oyster and the pearl. What an oyster, where a pearl comes from an oyster. How does an oyster create a pearl?
When the sand gets stuck in the oyster, start repelling it by this liquid, and it forms around the sand.
Yeah.
And it creates a pearl.
Yes, all the beautiful pearls are really slime. But anyway, it's grit that bothers the oyster. And in order to deal with that, the saliva, the whatever it is exactly that gets on that grit, keeps mounting up and mounting out until you have this beautiful pearl. Midrash is that. There was something in the text that bothered the rabbis who read the Torah very carefully. And so in order to explain those problems, many of these midrashim were created. For example, going back to the very beginning, as I said, we looked at the beginning of Genesis, Bereshit, the first word of the Torah is a problem. It's not easy to understand. It doesn't make real sense, grammatical sense. So the rabbis struggled with it. And so somebody came up with the idea of comparing it to where it says in Mishlei, in Proverbs, of wisdom being the first of God's creations. So Bereshit now becomes interpreted, meaning that God creates the world using the Torah as his guide.
I have a couple questions on this.
No problem, ask.
One, if he's using the Torah as his guide to create the earth, that means it was already preordained, which gets rid of all free will, which is not really what we're talking about. Either way. And my second issue, or not really issue, but question, and I forgot it. I'll try and remember and come back.
Well, if you remember it, you let me know.
Could it be maybe if it's all powerful, why does he need the Torah to spell out how to create the world?
No.
That was my question.
Actually, my other question was, if the Torah was created even before the earth and it's absolute, who are we to differentiate and interpret it between an oral Torah and a written Torah? Is it not perfect the way it is? Why are we picking and choosing it and having a completely different oral one?
All right. Well, first of all, I know the idea that the rabbis are expressing, remember, for the rabbis and for traditional Judaism in general, study and Torah are the most important, just about the most important things. For some, it's even more important than prayer. There's a whole argument on that. All right? So the Torah is the most important thing in creation according to that vision. And so it's so perfect, it has to pre-exist the earth, because the earth is imperfect. And people sin. And that's why the idea that is expressed here, the Torah says, I'm not so sure about this, because people are going to sin. They're going to make mistakes. They're not going to follow the Torah completely. So that's number one. As for the idea of free will, that is really one of the conundrums of Jewish theology. Rabbi Akiva famously said, everything is foreseen, but choice is given. And it seems to be contradictory. God knows what's going to happen, but we all have the free choice to decide what's going to happen. And so Maimonides, the Rambam, wants to limit, really, to a certain extent, God's intervention in the world. I'm sorry, I'm going off on a different tangent. We'll get back to this. So how do we understand that? So one way of looking at it is, if you're a parent, you know, sometimes you see a youngster, or even a pet, you know what they're going to do in a minute. You know it for sure. And sure enough, they do it. Now, did you take away their free will because you could see what they're going to do? So that's one way of understanding it. It's the depth of understanding of God, of human beings, that allows him to know what we're going to do even before we do it. Another understanding of it, and this is one I really prefer, is we live in a linear world, linear time. What is now is not what's going to be tomorrow. And what is now tomorrow is going to be history. God lives outside of time. Time is tied to the universe, to physical reality. For God, past, present, and future are all one and the same. When Moses is at the burning bush, God says, Eyeh asher eyeh. And they're very difficult to comprehend, but when Eyeh means I am. I am in the imperfect sense, meaning it's action that does not, incomplete action, it continuous. So therefore, God being outside of time has no relationship to time itself. So he sees our deeds before we've done them. Just like we see the child going to put their hand on something they shouldn't put their hand on. But even more certitude. We always have a little bit of doubt, but his certitude is above that. That's the more or less the traditional way of understanding it. All right. Or you say God doesn't know what we're going to do. That's a whole nother way of looking at it. Right? Now,
Can I add something? Oh, sorry.
let me just go back now. The other
Yes,
question about the
absolutely.
oral law. By the way, that's what the Karaites said. The Karaites were a sect in Judaism that differed from rabbinic tradition, and were very much upset with what the rabbis did, and claimed you had to live exactly by the words of the Torah itself without any interpretation. Of course, that's impossible. It says in the Torah, you will not kindle a light in your you will not kindle a light in your settlements on Shabbat. What does that mean? Does that mean we cannot ignite fire on Shabbat? Yes, probably. Does that mean we can't allow fire to continue to burn on Shabbat? In other words, what is being forbidden? The act of the kindling or the presence of having fire? The Karaites interpreted it the second way. The rabbi said, no, what was forbidden according to the oral Torah, which is the understanding of what the Torah is trying to tell us, was that you're not allowed to light a fire. You're not allowed to feed a fire on Shabbat, but a fire that's already started before Shabbat begins, it can take going. You don't need to eliminate it. You don't need to live in a dark house on Shabbat. There are many passages in the Torah that really need interpretation, no matter what you do. You have to have some kind of interpretation. So if you don't have that interpretation, then you don't know what to do. So the official interpretation is the oral law. And it's meant to explain. The rabbis say you're not supposed to add to the Torah. They believe they're not adding to the Torah. They're always just explaining, elucidating what the Torah says, what the Torah means. When you have passages in Deuteronomy that seem to contradict passages in Exodus or Leviticus, how do we understand them? How do we deal with them? So that is how the rabbis understood it, that the oral Torah was absolutely necessary. In any judicial system, you have written law and you have common law. Traditions of ways of doing things that were accepted as part of the legal system, even if it was never codified in a legal way. That's like oral Torah. Give an example, not necessarily always one. There is an oral tradition, or a tradition anyway, that when the President of the United States leaves office, he leaves a letter for the incoming president in the top drawer of the desk. That's been going on for a long time. You don't have to do it, but even Trump, on his way out of the office, left a letter for the incoming President Biden. Just like Obama had left one for him, just like Bush had left one for Obama, etc. That's nowhere written it has to be that way, but that's a tradition. So the oral law are these traditions that coincide with the Torah itself. Does that answer the question? There was another question somebody had.
I just wanted to add one thing, but thank
Yeah.
you for that explanation, Rabbi. If I could give my perspective,
Of
maybe I'm
course.
not sure to ask the
You know,
question.
I say there's no wrong question, and your answer is your answer. I might be wrong according to me, but we'll deal with it later.
So to ever ask the question, I think I could just lend something like in Judaism, and this is what the rabbi keeps referring to, is like there's zero absolutes. Like for every thing, there's like a million opinions, and it's hard to come down to like.
Well, yeah, well, we certainly do have many things that have various interpretations. There are many things to which the basic interpretation is the same. For example, nobody in Jewish tradition, traditionally, let's start that way, felt that any other day of the week except Saturday was the Sabbath. That is universal. Only in the Reform movement, in the middle 19th century and early 20th century, some of the rabbis of the Reform movement wanted to move the Sabbath to Sunday.
And then like the sect that grew out of Judaism. who followed
Well,
it.
we'll talk about Reform and Conservative and Orthodox later on in the year, but they meant well. They were afraid that the Jews weren't observing the Sabbath in any way, and they had to work on Saturday because of business and everything. So they wanted to make it easier by having their synagogue services and Sabbath observance, as it were, on Sunday. But that would have been considered by overwhelming majority of traditional rabbis as being really beyond the pale.
Sure. What I'm referring to is like grander concepts, like is everything preordained?
I'm sorry, a little louder. I couldn't quite hear you.
Oh, I'm talking about like the question was asked like, do we have free will? Like this Torah suggests that everything was like preordained, and the answer is like, oh, absolutely both, because this is the reasons everything preordained, and these are the reasons why we have free will. And for every like greater theoretical concept in Judaism, you'll find that where it's like, here are the supporting reasons, here are the other side of the coin. And
No, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. One of the greatest of rabbis, Rabbi Meir, the Mishnaic period, the law doesn't follow him because he was so sharp that he could give you 40 reasons to say why something was kosher and 40 reasons to tell you why the thing was not kosher. All right? So to be a great scholar, you got to know those kinds of things. And he was too great for them. That's why they don't usually decide the law. Sometimes the law was decided. Again, this is tradition. Okay? So no one in the Jewish circle, traditional Jewish circle, who considers themselves to be observant of the mitzvot would say you're allowed to light a fire on Shabbat. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean people don't light fires on Shabbat. It doesn't mean, especially in the Reform movement, that they didn't light candles on Friday night services in their temples because that's what they wanted to do. But no one could defend that from a strictly Torah perspective. Now, for a fish to be kosher, it has to have fins and scales. Some fish, it's debatable. Does it have the regular scales that we think are scales? Does it, or is not? That's why there were differences of opinion about sturgeon in the Middle Ages. That's why today there's the debate about the status of swordfish amongst some as to whether or not it qualifies as being kosher. When you come to theology, you're really right that the plethora of opinions grows. There's a very famous statement, Maimonides, in his Mishnah Torah, writes that God has no physical body. There's absolutely nothing physical about God. And he says, if you believe God has a body, a physical entity, you are a heretic. Rabbi Avraham ben David writes a comment on Maimonides' passage and says, greater rabbis than you believe that God had a physical body. Who are you to say they are heretics? It's a very famous statement that he makes. And we know when we look at the history of Jewish theology, there were people who believed that God had a physical existence.
Well, yeah, especially if we're made in his image or God's image, you would think that maybe God has some kind of a image. Yeah.
That is certainly a reasonable conclusion. Maimonides argues why philosophically that's not reasonable. And most Jews today accept that. Right? They accept the concept that God does not have any kind of physical existence. But there clearly was a period of history in which that was not an absolute accepted principle. Now, I said Avraham ben David, the Raavad, disagreed with Maimonides. He didn't disagree with Maimonides' position that God has no physical body. He agreed with that. What he disagreed with is how can Maimonides say anybody who believed otherwise was a heretic? Because we know great rabbis had that belief. Today, most people would say if you believe that God has a physical body, you're gone past the limits of Jewish theology. Okay? All right, so let's look back again. I wanted to do some more of these midrashic on some of these passages. There we are. Okay, share. Okay. Now, some of the midrash, this kind of midrash, was collected in separate books. Some of it can be found in the Talmud as well. As a matter of fact, in last week's Torah portion, we came across something. This is found actually. This is in the Talmud. Actually, it's in the part of the Talmud that we call the Daf Yomi. I was learning this week. The English translation here is from a source that I just copied, so I didn't have to spend all the time translating it. And the dark print is what is actually written. The smaller size print is added to it to help us understand. So coming here, this was taught by Theodosius of Rome. What did Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah see that led them to deliver themselves to the fiery furnace for the sanctification of the name of God during the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, rather than worship idols under duress? So he wanted this Theodosius of Rome, interesting individual, says, in the book of Daniel, we're told about these three guys who are told to worship an idol or Nebuchadnezzar would throw them into the furnace. So he says, how do they know that you had to give up your life rather than worship an idol? So he answers his own question. They drew a fortiori inference, we call it Hebrew kal v'chomer, from a major to a minor, on their own from the plagues of frogs in Egypt. With regard to the frogs, which are not commanded concerning the sanctification of the name of God. God doesn't tell frogs they have to sanctify the name of God. But it says in the Torah, the river shall swarm with frogs, which shall go up and come into your house, and your bedchamber is your bed, and the house is your servants, your people, and into their ovens and kneading bowls. It says with the plague of frogs we read about last week, that's the language that is used. They're going to come into your house, and into your ovens and kneading bowls. So he continues. When are kneading bowls found near the oven? When you put a bowl that's dough has been kneaded in next to the oven, you must say it was in the oven is hot, right? You want the bread to rise. So if you make bread, you know that you put it in the oven or next to the oven to let it rise the first time. So the frogs went into the kneading bowls, okay. But where else did they go? They went into the hot ovens, which were hot because God commanded it. If in fulfilling the command to harass the Egyptians, the frogs entered the burning ovens, all the more so are we who are commanded concerning the sanctification of the name of God should deliver ourselves to be killed in the fiery furnace for that purpose. So this midrash is simply asking, how do we know from nature that there is a limit to our ability to save our lives at the expense of honoring God? How can we draw a limit? And so oh, my phone couldn't find a contact named Lemon. All right. So he draws an analogy from something that was part of nature. He says, look, frogs aren't commanded to honor God's name. We are. The frogs were prepared to give up their life. So we too should be prepared to give up our life. Okay. All right, so now we're going to come to a section now. We're still in what we call Midrash Agadah, but we are, and this is still not part of the Talmud, so we're interested here in a story not for legal purposes yet, although this story has an effect on a legal set of things later on. Now, when we say the Shema every day, after we say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, we add the words Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Blessed be the name. All right. Blessed be the name of His glorious kingdom forever and ever. But that's not in the Torah. So why do we say that verse? Now, one answer could be given. It's historical, that in the temple we know that that they didn't say amen to a blessing. They said Baruch Shem Kavod. They said this passage in the temple. So that may have just been the historical practice. But Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish wants to come up with another explanation. He says, he interpreted it homiletically. As Rabbi Shimon Lakish said, is written, Jacob called his sons and said, gather around and I will tell you what will occur at the end of days. Jacob wanted to reveal to his sons when the complete redemption would arrive at the end of days. So playing on the words, I will tell you what will occur in the end of days. So Reish Lakish, Shimon ben Lakish says, he's not talking about in the near future, he's talking about way in the future. He wanted to reveal this to his sons, but the divine presence abandoned him, rendering him unable to prophesy. God wouldn't let him do it. He said, perhaps the divine presence has abandoned me because heaven forfend, one of my descendants is unfit. Maybe God left me because one of my children is not going to follow the path. All right. As was the case with my grandfather Abraham, from whom Ishmael emerged. And like my father Yitzhak, Isaac, from whom Esau emerged. Okay, he says, maybe God's abandoned me because one of you 12 are moving away from God. So what happened? The son said to him, hear, Israel, our father, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Just as there is only one God in your heart, so too there is only one in our hearts. So they said the word, Shema Yisrael, because Yisrael's their father. Listen, Dad, Israel, we promise you, we all worship the one God, no problems. And in that moment, Jacob, our father, said in praise, blessed be the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. So as a reminder of what took place then, we today say Baruch Shem Kavod when we say the Shema. Right? So this midrash is trying to explain a tradition that we have. All right? Now, there's another work called the Tanchuma, who again talks about the creation story. I just wanted to share a couple of different things with you. It says, in the beginning, that's the translation I had there, God created the heavens and the earth. It is written in Psalm, who roofs his upper rooms in the waters, who sets the clouds as his chariot. Rabbi Yochanan said, heaven and earth were created on the first day, and on the second, the Holy One created the firmament and the angels. Where did angels come from? Anybody remember seeing them being mentioned about being created? No. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying they were created then. Where is it shown that they were created on the second day? How do you know that? Where does it say, who roofs his upper rooms in the waters? So the Midrash interprets the roof as the firmament. And so when it said, so when Psalm 104 is talking about roofs his upper rooms in the waters, it's talking about the second day of creation. Who sets the clouds as his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind, ruach. And what is written next in verse 4? Who makes his angels spirit, ruach. So it says from Psalm 104, using the passage there, we want to prove the angels were created the same day as God created the firmament. And what is written? Okay. Rabbi Hanania said the angels were created on the fifth day. Who was arguing? Jonathan was arguing about difference of opinion. Here we go. Right away, we got a difference of opinion. Angels on the fifth day. Thus it is written concerning the fifth day in Genesis, and let fowl fly, Ye'ofef, above the earth. Now the word Ye'ofef only refers to the flying of angels. What do you mean? What's flying here? Angels, as it is used in Isaiah 6:2, when it talks about Isaiah's vision. We looked at that last 2 weeks ago. It says, with the two did he fly, Ye'ofef, the angels with two of their wings, they flew. So, and why were the angels not created on the first day? So why didn't God create the angels at the very beginning of creation? So the answers, so that the heretics would not say, Michael was standing to the north with Gabriel to the south, and together they spread out the heavens and earth. All right? God didn't have any helpers. Unless because he made the angels on the first day, you might say they created the firmament. They were God helpers. So the Holy One by himself, as stated in the beginning, God created. So in this case, we want to answer two questions. We want to answer where do the angels come into being? And so we see there are two different answers given for that. And then another question is, why aren't the angels at the beginning with God? Remember, we talked, earlier the Midrashim talked about God creating the Torah before creation and all kinds of other things that were created. So why didn't God create the angels before creation? Well, so you won't make a mistake to think that God had partners in creation. Now, it is possible that this is also an attempt to deny Christian theology, to say that God has a partner in the sense of Jesus at creation. So that's a possibility as well, but you have to be very careful when you start deciding whether or not a passage is intended as against Christian theology or whatever. Okay. I want to go back to that other chart. Okay. So now, this has been what we call Midrash Agadah. The Midrash Agadah are stories or homiletics meant to elucidate mostly on questions of what might be theology, might be things that are missing in the accounts of the Torah that we want to fill in the blanks. But also alongside the Midrash Agadah, the homiletical Midrash, we have what is legal Midrash or Midrash Halacha. Midrash Halacha also follows the pattern of following the Torah portions, but its concern is not the narrative so much as the legal. To make understanding what is the Torah teaching us about the laws. So, for example, there's a work called the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. We just today reviewed this Shabbos Torah portion, or talked about it. All right. So in chapter 12, we have the introduction of the calendar. So the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael starts off by quoting this verse. This month shall be to you the beginning of months. So Rabbi Yishmael says, Moses pointed out the new moon to Israel and said to them, thus shall it look, and the new month be designated by thereby for all generations. So we want to, the Midrash here is saying, establishing, what does it mean, Chodesh Hazeh, this month? Now the word Chodesh has also the meaning of Chadash, of new. So the new moon is the beginning of the month. What is the new moon supposed to look like? So according to Rabbi Yishmael, Moses points it to the people, shows them what it's supposed to be. So then he goes on to say, Rabbi Akiva says this is one of the three things which Moses could not visualize until they were pointed out to him by the Lord. So he talks about a number of things here. I'm going to skip over that because it's getting late already. But then it says this month is a little bit later on in the Mechilta. What month is this one? It says, "HaChodesh is Rosh HaChodashim." The Torah does not give names to the months. The months are just listed, first, second, third, fourth. So what is this month? So the Midrash says Nisan. So now it says, wait a minute. You say it's Nisan, but perhaps it was some other month of the year. Maybe, how do I know it's Nisan? The month that we now call Nisan. So he says it's written in Exodus 23:16, and the festival of the ingathering, which is Sukkot, at the end of the year. And the festival of the ingathering at the turn of the year. In which month is there an ingathering and a turning from one solstice to another, and the expiration of a year? Tishrei. So that's why we have Rosh Hashanah and Tishrei. After learning that the seventh month is Tishrei, right, because it called it the seventh month. At the end of the year, the festival, all right, that's Tishrei, which is the seventh month. So after learning that it's the seventh month, then the first month must be Nisan. Even though there's no proof for this, it is intimated in Esther in the first month, the month of Nisan. So what is happening here could be simply explaining what's in the Torah. It could be explaining what tradition had set up as being the correct way of seeing the Torah and reading it back into the Torah, depending upon your approach. But clearly what this is meant to do as a legal thing is to establish that the year, at least in the Bible, starts in Nisan with the new moon of the first month, which we call today Nisan, not any other month. Even though we talk about other Rosh Hashanahs, they have other kinds of meanings in the rabbinic age. Okay, so now a little bit later, we find the next thing in the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yoshia says, whence is it derived that the years intercalated, I'll explain this in a minute, only in the great Beit Din in Jerusalem? It is, all right, so from the verse which says, it is for you, speak. And it's talking Moses and Aaron, the leaders of generation, etc. All right. First, we have to understand what are we asking about. The calendar, way back when, remember, I told you, it's a solar lunar calendar. Basically, lunar, that it's adjusted to meet the needs of the holidays falling in the proper seasons. And we do that by adding a month to the calendar. So the question is, who has the authority to do that? I'm Joe Blow. I live in the Upper Galilee 3,000 years ago. I go for a walk. I see what I think is a new moon. So I tell all my neighbors, today is Rosh Chodesh. Wait a minute, it's too early. If this is Rosh Chodesh Adar, Nisan is going to come too early. So I'm going to decide to add a month to the calendar. The next town over, some other guy walks over and he says, the new moon. Good, Pesach's only a month away. So he does it. Who's got the right to decide? So they said the Sanhedrin, the great court in Jerusalem, was the only court that could decide on whether or not to make it a leap year. Why? Because when God speaks to Moses and talks to him about the calendar, he talks to Moses, speak you, Moses and Aaron, and the leaders of the generation, which that's just like the great Sanhedrin. So that is trying to establish the authority of the rabbis in the Sanhedrin to determine the calendar. That's one of the most important items in any religious civilization. Who determines the calendar determines lots of things. And so it's a very important aspect of the religious life. All right. So now, here's another example from Midrash Halacha. This from Devarim, Sefer Devarim. And it's talking about the Shema. And we had the Shema before, right? We saw that a little bit earlier in the Midrash about Jacob and his sons. So where the Shema actually appears is in the book of Deuteronomy. So the Sifrei Devarim, which is another rabbinic work of Midrash, so you shall love the Lord your God. Act that is served out of love. There's a difference between acting out of love and acting out of fear. If one acts out of love, his reward is doubled. It is written, the Lord your God shall you fear, and him shall you serve. One may fear his friend, but if he belabors him, he may leave him. But you act out of absolute love, and there's no absolute love in the place of absolute fear, and no absolute fear in the place of absolute love, except in relationship to the Holy One, blessed be he. So that if one loves him absolutely, it follows he fears him absolutely, and his reward is doubled. So when we worship God, we're supposed, in this passage of the Shema, it says, is to teach us this idea. All right, I'm going to, what time is it? All right, we're going to end here for tonight, and we will continue next week at this point. Are there any, stop sharing. Any questions anybody has right now? Have I overwhelmed you completely? The purpose, right, by the way, the purpose tonight is not for you to remember all these midrashim. I promise I will not ask you questions about it. I'm just trying to let you see and understand what's going on. Next week we'll get to the Talmud. Then I'll really make you work hard.
Rabbi, can you next week maybe at least help me a little bit more understand, because I'm confused with the Talmud, with the Midrash, and the Mishnah. Okay. Those three concepts are just ever.
So far tonight, all we've talked about is Midrash. Okay, we've talked about Midrash. Sometimes some of the Midrash may be found in the Talmud. Okay, because the Talmud's got lots of things in it. But we haven't touched upon the Mishnah itself or the Talmud. all we've been doing so far is looking at midrash and showing you how the two kinds of midrash exist. And then next week, we will get into Mishnah and Talmud and some other and the legal areas. Okay? Any other questions? All right, ladies and
I have a
gentlemen.
question.
Yeah. See you next week. And for all, good night.